There was a time when watching a film required more than having the right format. It required access. Owning a DVD or a VHS tape was one way to watch something. But for most people, access to films came from somewhere else. A store, rows of shelves lined with cases. Each case representing a single copy of a film. What you could watch depended on what was there. And more importantly, on what was left. Video rental stores did not offer unlimited access. They operated on inventory. Each title existed in a fixed number of copies. Each copy could only be rented by one person at a time. This created a constraint. Even if a film existed, even if you knew what you wanted to watch, you could not always access it. If all copies were rented, it was unavailable. Not hidden, not delayed, simply not there. This made availability visible. Empty slots on shelves. Missing cases. Labels without copies behind them. Scarcity was not abstract, it was physical. Access required presence. You had to go to the store, walk the aisles, search through what remained. Selection was not infinite. It was limited by what the store carried and what other people had already taken. Timing mattered. Arrive early, and the shelves were full. Arrive late, and the choices were reduced. The same store, the same titles, could offer completely different options, depending on when you arrived. Entertainment was not on demand. It was contingent. You did not choose from everything that existed. You chose from what was available at that moment. This shaped behavior. People planned around releases. They visited stores at specific times. They made decisions based on what they could find, not just what they preferred. The store was not just a distribution point. It was a filter, and that filter was defined by scarcity. Entertainment had limits, not because content did not exist, but because access to it was constrained. And for a long time, that constraint defined how people experienced film. This is the story of video rentals. The limits of video rental did not disappear immediately. They began to weaken. At first, the change came from within the system itself. Formats evolved. VHS tapes were replaced by DVDs. Discs were smaller, cheaper to produce, and easier to store. A store could carry more copies of the same title. Inventory increased. Shelves became denser. Availability improved. Scarcity did not disappear, but it became less visible. Where there were once only a few copies, there were now many. The chance of a title being unavailable decreased. Access was still tied to inventory, but the limits began to stretch. Then distribution started to shift. Rental no longer required immediate presence. Services emerged that allowed films to be ordered remotely and delivered later. Selection was no longer limited to what a single store could hold. It expanded beyond physical shelves. Availability improved again. Not instantly, but predictably. You might not get a film immediately, but you would get it. The idea of not there began to change. At the same time, the structure of rental itself began to soften. Late fees, once a defining feature of the system, started to lose their importance. Return times became more flexible. Penalties became less central. The pressure to return quickly decreased. This changed behavior. The urgency of scarcity faded. Access became less about timing and more about scheduling. You did not need to arrive early to secure a copy. You only needed to wait. This was the transition. Scarcity was no longer absolute, it was managed. The system still relied on physical copies, still depended on distribution, still required inventory, but the edges were no longer sharp. Availability expanded, constraints relaxed, and once scarcity could be reduced without removing the system entirely, it became clear that the system itself was no longer necessary. The boundary had not yet collapsed, but it had begun to dissolve. The final shift did not come from improving rental, it came from removing it. As internet speeds increased and digital infrastructure matured, films no longer needed to be distributed as objects. They could be delivered instantly. Streaming platforms did not operate on inventory. They did not manage copies. They did not track which version of a film was currently in use. A single file could be accessed by millions of people at the same time. Availability was no longer limited by quantity. It became constant. There were no empty shelves, no missing cases, no need to arrive early or wait for returns. The condition that once defined access scarcity was removed entirely. This changed the structure of choice. You no longer considered what was available. You assumed it was selection expanded beyond the limits of any physical system. Entire catalogs could be accessed from a single device. The idea of out of stock disappeared. So did the need to manage access. There were no return dates, no late fees, no penalties for keeping something too long. Time was no longer a constraint. You could start, stop, and return at will. Access became continuous. This eliminated the function of the rental store. The store had existed to manage scarcity, to control access through inventory, to distribute limited copies across many people. Once scarcity no longer existed, the store no longer had a role. The system did not evolve. It was replaced. Not because it failed, but because the condition it was built to manage no longer existed. Scarcity had defined entertainment. Now, it was gone. And with it, the need to go anywhere to watch anything. The removal of scarcity did not make entertainment worse. It made it easier. Access became immediate. Selection became vast. The effort required to watch something disappeared. You no longer needed to plan, no longer needed to travel, no longer needed to compete for a copy. You only needed to choose. This was a gain. But abundance introduced a different condition. When options are limited, decisions are constrained. When options are unlimited, decisions expand. Choice becomes constant. You are no longer selecting from what is available. You are selecting from what is possible. This changes how content is experienced. In a system defined by scarcity, each selection carried weight. You committed to what you found. You watched what you chose. You lived with the limitations of your decision. In a system defined by abundance, commitment becomes optional. You can start and stop at any time. Switch between titles without cost. Move from one piece of content to another without friction. This reduces consequence. The act of watching becomes flexible, but it also becomes fragmented. Content competes with content. Attention shifts more frequently. Completion is no longer required. The experience becomes lighter. This is not necessarily a loss. It is a redistribution. Scarcity created anticipation. Abundance creates immediacy. Scarcity limited choice. Abundance multiplies it. Scarcity made availability meaningful. Abundance makes availability assumed. The difference is subtle, but it changes behavior. You no longer plan what to watch. You browse. You no longer wait for access. You expect it. And once expectation replaces limitation, the absence of scarcity stops being noticed, because it becomes the default. Video rental stores did not vanish entirely. For a time, they lingered. Empty aisles, reduced inventories, fewer visitors. The shelves were still there, but the condition that gave them purpose was gone. Scarcity had defined the experience. Without it, the structure remained, but the meaning changed. A rental store without scarcity is not a system, it is a space. What once required timing, presence, and selection became optional. You no longer needed to go anywhere. And once the need disappeared, the ritual began to fade. The act of going to a store, walking the aisles, and choosing from what remained was not just a method of access. It was part of the experience. You saw what others had taken. You felt what was missing. You adjusted your choice in real time. Scarcity shaped behavior. It created anticipation. The uncertainty of availability made selection meaningful. You did not always get what you wanted, but you made a decision within limits. That decision carried weight. When scarcity disappeared, that structure changed. Choice expanded. But the context that gave choice its significance became less visible. You no longer see what is missing, only what is present. The absence of limitation removes friction, but it also removes contrast. This is not necessarily a loss. It is a shift. The rental store becomes a memory, not because it was better, but because it operated under conditions that no longer exist. Scarcity is no longer part of the experience. It is something that can only be remembered, and in that memory, the meaning of limitation becomes clearer, not as an obstacle, but as a structure that once shaped how entertainment was chosen, experienced, and valued. Today, access is immediate. Availability is assumed. And the idea that something might not be there at all has become unfamiliar.